Welcome to Data Skeptic, a podcast exploring the methods, use cases, and consequences of recommender systems. Welcome to another installment of Data Skeptic Recommender Systems. Today we'll pose the question posed in our guest Hannes' paper, are some books better than others? Of course, to answer that question, one of the places Hannes looks is the classic Goodreads dataset. Goodreads is a website where users can mark books that they have read, are currently reading, or want to read. Additionally, they can rate them from 1 to 5 and link with other users like a friend's network. Hannes takes advantage of that feature especially to connect different users to users. Alongside it, you get typical metadata like titles and a little description. It's a pretty rich data set. So when it came to this first paper we're going to discuss, Hannes was really trying to figure out what makes a person rate a book well. You would think this would have some obvious features like they prefer a certain genre or they love a couple of, well-published authors that they always read their books. At first glance, I would think all of the typical feature engineering work would be at play here and helping out. But there's insights in today's interview that are likely to surprise you when it comes to answering that question. They certainly did me. We'll go through all that and a few other topics in just a moment.
My name is Hannes Rosenbusch. I'm professionally affiliated to the University of Amsterdam. I'm sitting there in the Department of Psychological Methods, and I teach in the Data Science Master.
Well, that's not necessarily unique in the whole world, but it's maybe unusual that you would have, feet in multiple worlds like this, and we haven't even gotten to fiction yet. Can you talk a little bit about how you balance these things?
Yes, I'm indeed all alone on my corridor. Nobody else is interested in fiction professionally, so I have to wander off to other buildings to find people to talk about this. I guess coming from psychology is not super uncommon nowadays to wander off into statistics and then potentially data science, given that all psychology students have to work through statistics in their studies, and then 1% of them likes it. And then half of those people like programming and they become data scientists. So that's the course that I've taken through my studies. And then fiction literature just came from, a hobby. As I don't know if you've seen the stuff that I've written about during my PhD, etc., but it wasn't so much about literature at all. And then a few years ago, when I got more serious about writing fiction literature instead of just reading it, then my research also went into that direction. And then I was already employed at the place where I was now. So then I had to look for new friends to talk about this research with.
So broadly, how would you define your research interests? What are the questions you're chasing?
At the moment, well, if you count the stuff that I'm doing with my various PhD students, it's very broad. And what unites them is using machine learning methods or anything in the world of AI or computational methods, some sort of innovative stuff that isn't common in psychology to do psychological research. So I have one PhD student that works on integrating these methods to do a better job at educating, grading, feedbacking stuff for students. I have another PhD student that works on mechanic interpretability for large language models. So it's really quite diverse, but if I get a day alone at my office and I hack away at projects, then it's all about understanding and trying to quantify the quality and the merit of books, fiction books, that is.
Well, that's something that is no easy feat. There isn't a standard SI unit for measuring a book. What kind of metrics do you look at?
Yeah, that is indeed. It's so complicated. It's almost like asking a psychologist, well, a person is pretty complicated. What could you possibly measure to quantify a person? And the answer is, well, we can measure their intelligence, but we can also measure how far their mouth is away from their eyes or whatever psychologists do. And so computational literary researchers do measure also a huge amount of different things when it comes to books. A lot of people, for instance, they're interested in, well, how do I get kids to read, etc. And so they might try to quantify how difficult is it to understand this text, or what age group is this suitable for? And that's not so much me, but these are common metrics that people look at. Other metrics are, well, how popular was this book among readers? That's more in my direction. I want to find out what makes a book good. And that's very natural for me because I'm a fiction writer. So all I ask myself all day is this good? Why did I think yesterday that it was good when it's really not good? And so trying to quantify these things is really close to my interest. And then also, once, and I guess we'll talk about the paper in a bit, once I found out that, well, there's no reliable way to quantify these things, at least not in absolute terms, then I'm shifting towards, okay, now let's quantify reader preferences. Um, Not just, how can we cluster them? What are predictors that differentiate between readers when it comes to enjoying books? These are the kinds of metrics that I look at.
So then, in the case of your paper, are some books better than others? How can we make better a qualitative measure? What are you looking at there?
In that book, are some books better than others? Kind of a big, maybe such a big title that it's a little bit silly and a little bit tongue in cheek. Again, it's almost like saying, are some people better than others? It's so loaded and so big that I had fun keeping the title like this. And now the paper was very recently now accepted at a Journal of Computational Literary Studies. They obviously said, well, we have to twist the title a little bit, make it more specific to the kind of data that you collect. So maybe it's going to be named something else once we're done with that pipeline. I think we added a little subtitle to it. But what we did was we looked at the ratings people gave books on the platform Goodreads.com, which I think is the largest online platform for social reading, writing reviews, giving star ratings, and cataloging your reading experiences. In technical terms, we try to distinguish the source of rating variance. That means when we look at how ratings are distributed for different books, how much of that rating variance comes from the book, meaning if there's big differences between books, some are reliably higher rated than others, then we would see, okay, that's the important source of variance for rating. Some books are simply better than others according to the ratings versus another source of variance, which is the reader. Do some people just give high ratings? Do some people give more critical reviews, etc.? And so quantitatively, we pulled apart these sources of variance and we found something that did not surprise us too much, which is that the differences between books, especially professionally published books, as you mostly encounter on Goodreads, are very minimal. Most books, especially if they have a couple of ratings only, they just fall into the same corridor of ratings, and the differences between them are, to use a loaded term, not significant or anything like that. But we see the opposite for readers. Some readers, if you get that reader, you're going to get a high rating. If you get another reader, you are at risk of getting a low rating. So clearly, books' contents and quality is debatable and hugely non-consensual. You can aggregate 20 ratings from different people and 20 ratings for another book, and you still will have no idea which book is better, given that both of these books were professionally edited.
Could it be that maybe the raters themselves have a different philosophy about how to rate? I'm sure some people, everything's 5 stars because they're just, I don't know, kind and generous. Other people are maybe overly critical, and you see a full range of lots of ones and lots of threes and whatnot.
Yeah.
Could that be normalized somehow?
I'm not sure how it could be normalized, but it is a very big problem because even though there's some people that say, I love all books, I love reading, etc., I don't believe it, or I hardly ever believe it. But we do see that some people just habitually give 5 stars, right? And that might be because they only record those reading experiences that they enjoyed, for example. So naturally, you end up with a massive bias in that regard towards positive ratings. We did a few things to try and go past that. And one of them is to look at the written reviews and see which kind of things, not just how positive and negative these reviews are in terms of sentiment. We replicated the main analyses with these scores and kind of found the same thing, but also to see what do people mention when they write book reviews. And if person A mentions, let's say that this is way too long, that book, or it's boring or whatever, is there now an increased chance that somebody else also writes that? So to kind of see, okay, is there at least a consensus when it comes to the issues that are being brought up in a written way? But also there we found that the contents of the reviews, again, are much more typical of the reader than they are of the book, which is very shocking, I think, for me as a reader, because whenever I read a book, I have the feeling like everybody needs to not like this for the same reason that I'm not liking this, and the other way around. How can you possibly not enjoy this book when it so clearly does X and Y? But then, also for my own personal reading experience, then I go into the reviews and I have to scroll and scroll until finally somebody says the thing that I also thought. So it seems like we really are all over the place when it comes to these aesthetic perceptions.
So we've touched on the ratings themselves and looking into the written reviews. Are there any other elements of, I guess, metadata you have available that are of interest?
In terms of evaluation, Goodreads does not have them. I think some movie websites have things like favorite a book, etc. I'm not sure if Goodreads has that too. The coolest metric that I think is out there that would be nice to analyze, but that I don't have access to, is read through rates and read through times, maybe. So, for instance, Amazon has these online services where you read and they track how far do you read, etc. And they also use that, I think, in their recommendation systems, etc. And to score how well is a book doing or how well is it doing for a certain group of readers. Goodreads doesn't have that, but that would be so cool to have. So if there's a data set out there, somebody listening to the podcast, send it to me because I'd be happy to have it.
So there's a website, I don't know if it's popular where you are, but it's called Yelp, and it's for rating local businesses. And my anecdotal observation everywhere I've lived, which is, basically 3 cities now, every restaurant that's worth going to at least is 4 point something. It's almost like the first digit's irrelevant now. And the second digit seems to be almost variance or noise some of the time. I don't know that those ratings are very telling. Do you think Goodreads suffers the same problem?
Exactly the same, I think. First, there's some upward bias in ratings. People are nice, etc. People ask for reviews, whatever. So there's some upward bias that doesn't happen so much in Goodreads, but that's the thing you also see there. And then you need a crazy high amount of ratings for that second decibel to stabilize, basically. So I'm not sure how it is for Yelp, but for Goodreads, you have to have, I don't know, hundreds, thousands. I think we looked at this in a while. It's not in the paper, but we tried to see how long until it stabilizes, and it takes a lot of time. But then at some point it does, though. So there's a certain number. Some books are out there with tens of thousands of ratings, 100,000 ratings. Yes, it's stabilized, especially for books. Yelp service, the restaurant might change over the years. The book kind of stays the same. The public still changes, so there's drift. For instance, Harry Potter books now rated much lower for political reasons, etc. The book hasn't changed, but the public has. And so there is a slow drift, but not so much. However, if a book has, let's say, 20,000 ratings, and another book has also 20,000 ratings, and they're zero point 0.3 apart or so on the rating scale, that's fairly reliable. They're going to be apart also next time they get 20,000 ratings. However, this difference is then still not predictive of an individual person's enjoyment. So you personally don't have to care that much whether it's a 4.1 or a 4.3. It's not that indicative. I did that correlation for myself, and the correlation between my personal ratings of books and the global ratings was like 0.2 or something like that. So relying on it is not a very good idea.
So you were saying if it gets about, I don't know if it's 10 or 20,000 reviews, that number sort of converges. What's it converging to if it doesn't correlate with actual user preferences?
I think it does. I think there is such a thing as things that work in general for the reader. So if a book does more of those things, it's more likely to get a high score. But because it's so high dimensional, that only crystallizes out later. And then it really just means mainstream appeal. basically. The things that differentiate these 4.2 versus 4.4 books with huge amounts of ratings. And you also get probably some self-serving things, like you don't want to be the person that downgrades this book that all your friends have given a high grade to, etc. So these things, they also play into it, like legend status or classic status among books, etc. So there are understandable reasons for these reliable differences, but they don't really reflect what you can expect in terms of aesthetic appreciation when you read the book.
Could it be that there's some hidden variable here that hasn't been considered, like if only you take page count or genre into consideration, suddenly the correlation would be there?
I think there are tons of things that predict, and I'm on the hunt of them. So we are writing papers that really focus on finding these things, like page count. I'm sure there is, averaging across every other attribute of books, there are things like sweet spots, right? That you can hit. You don't want necessarily to hit them as an author because you're writing for the mysterious average person then, rather than your target reader group or your genre group or whatever you have. So usually these signals are so low that I'm not sure if they're worth optimizing for. So we did some analyses of individual readers, and we did, for instance, for page count, we did the correlations. How does it predict the rating that this reader gives in the end? And sometimes they are, significantly different from zero, these correlations, but they're never like amazing, like 0.7 or 0.8. And it would also be crazy if they were. Like, you would have to like all the short books and hate all the long books. What a funny brain you would have if that's how your book appreciation works. But they can be predictive. Unfortunately, I would love to find a silver bullet at one point, not about the general reader, but just about myself, saying like, can be fairly abstract, but if this book has this thing or does this thing, I love it or I hate it, but I haven't found it yet, but I'm looking for it all the time.
Well, if I understood correctly, you found that experienced reviewers converged more than the casual reviewers did, which seems almost surprising to me. I would think that every reviewer is an independent and identically distributed process, just a random sample. Do you think that's false, or is it that maybe experienced reviewers have some sort of hive mind thing going on?
I think there's two explanations that where I'm not sure if they're jointly responsible for this or whether it's one of the two or none of the two. One is that there are things like reviewers who want to, I don't know, have a lot of followers on Goodreads, etc. So they go where the mainstream goes with their rating, and they first very much check what's the average person's response, what's the current rating of the book, etc. I can imagine that that's the thing. Being an influencer, maybe on Goodreads, trying to align with the masses as you already see them. So that's kind of a boring explanation of this. There's also something that, as an experienced reader or writer, you come to this point where you think you know better. And a little bit, maybe every now and then, you do know better. Maybe you read more attentively. Like, oh, on page 20, I was promised this. It was not delivered, etc. This is not a good thing. And almost everyone would, once they see this, would accept that that's not a good thing, or at least a large amount of people would accept that rubric point. And the more you read or the more you write, the more you become sensitive because you talk about these rubric points all the time, such as, is this the right level of complexity for this genre, or do they miss the mark in that? Are they inconsistent in their characterization without providing explanations for shifts in character appearance or personality? And usually that's not a good thing. And most people would agree on that rubric point as well. So the more sensitive you get to that, the more your rating will approximate the general rating, which is more noisy, because a less experienced reader is less likely to think about these things, and they are more intuitive maybe in their rating, versus an experienced reviewer potentially is more structured in their evaluation. That's a slightly cooler explanation of the same phenomenon. Which, to what degree these two contribute to this finding, I'm not sure.
Do you see any differences between fiction and nonfiction, in this regard at least?
Troublingly, if we do this variance disaggregation method, we didn't see any differences at all, which is funny, right? Because you would think that nonfiction, okay, it's science, so people should agree on the quality of what is being presented, etc. But no, there was no difference in that regard. I think maybe because people also score nonfiction literature on things like just enjoyability, etc. Very few readers or raters go through the trouble of fact checking a work or catching a bad book and then not catching a good book, etc. I'm not too sure. I'm not a, I say that as a scientist, the following sentence probably not good. I'm not an expert on nonfiction literature, but we didn't find any big differences. However, I do think that there are differences in the rubrics that people apply when they do these things. So there are hypotheses out there that some people are reading to gain information rather than just for entertainment or aesthetic pleasure. You will find those readers naturally a lot more in the nonfiction part of the book world, and so they might very likely apply different rubrics to it. Unfortunately, when it comes to the end rating of the book, they're just as all over the place as everyone else.
Well, to revisit my personal experience, I don't care much for Yelp ratings. I ignore those now just based on what I've learned looking at the site. How has your research informed the way you look at Goodreads ratings?
Well, I try to guess them usually. So when I read a book, I avoid the self-serving biases of looking at the ratings first. And instead, I make my own rating. I write down what I liked and what I disliked about the book. And then separately, I think, okay, how well is this going to fare in the Goodreads world? Hoping that it has a ton of ratings and that I guess the rating right. And that's nice because I find out some things that are different for me as a reader compared to the averaged reader. Such as, I don't really care a lot if the main character is morally ambiguous or even very clearly evil or vile or anything like that. Typically, that is a negative predictor of how people evaluate the book. For me, it doesn't matter much. So when I go from my own rating to the predicted rating, I'm going to try and factor that out. And that's how I deal with the Goodreads ratings. They are just an indicator. This is what the average market thinks about this. And it's just a fun game I play with myself to see. I don't know, you could also do that with Yelp. I guess you can go to the restaurant and then see, okay, how did they do? And it's just kind of fun.
Do you think there's any wisdom or insights that the recommender system community should take away from this work in particular?
Yeah, well, that the intercept is not very predictive, I guess, is the very basic takeaway. I have thoughts on recommender systems in the book world. So in terms of like what kind of recommender system, I very much like content-based recommender systems for books. So meaning not just blind clustering of like these users and these items belong together, kind of in an atheoretical way, but to really try to characterize the book quantitatively and then make predictions from that. I never had these two things compete with each other really and know that this one is better, but I like it because it helps me as a reader gain insights about myself, the content-based recommendation as opposed to the other one. Like I said, I'm searching for the silver bullet. I want to know what makes a book work for me. I know it's not something like genre. For some people, that might work okay-ish, the genre predictor. For me, it doesn't work that well. So I'm happy to take a cut in terms of prediction or recommendation accuracy for it being content-based so that I can try to understand myself, my own reading experiences better. So what I'm doing is I'm building my own recommendation systems. They're kind of out there in terms of how they work. I just ran it this morning. So it splits my data into train test. It runs the train data through a fully automated annotation system. I haven't written a paper about it yet, but actually the hypothesizing about my tastes is also automated. It's just with modern reasoning models that look at my ratings, look at my written notes, and then say, well, I suggest this predictor, and this predictor, and this predictor. And then it checks the training accuracy, etc. And then it refines its hypotheses about the content of the book. These search-enabled LLMs are great for that. You can find a lot of information about the book online. What are the themes, the genres, the whatever, very specific things. And typically then it does binary annotations. Sometimes it scores things like top 20 comments on Goodreads, what did they mention, etc. Uses that as a predictor and just try to climb and climb and climb a little bit. And then later I can go in and look, okay, these are the top predictors, or these are the most positive, these are the most negative. That's so interesting, etc. And I can carry that from website to website with me because that recommender system is now kind of in my head, a bad version of it, right? It's not a random forest or whatever this script uses, but at least I know the best features. That's portable and that's great. And that helps me to understand myself. So these are the recommender systems that I like. I don't enjoy these collaborative filtering things where it's just based on your history. Other people like this, and then I don't understand anything about myself.
Well, if we're exploring alternatives to some of the plain vanilla methods in recommender systems, could we also touch on your other paper, Which Books Do I Like? And the Isaac method, which is introspection, support, AI annotation, and curation. Could you talk a little bit about the framework?
Yes, that was kind of the first attempt at the thing that I described, where it was still me who came up with the hypotheses. And then I just asked these LM agents to just do the annotation, not the hypothesizing. But there I threw out tons of hypotheses, like, oh, check all the genres. How are they distributed across my rating scale? Check the page number. Check the average rating on Goodreads. Check whether it's about a male main character or female main character. You know, the identification with the protagonist. There are theories how that is super important. So there's a bunch of predictors describing the protagonist, etc. Turns out that none of them are super predictive in my case, but it has been hypothesized that at least for some people it is predictive, and I believe it. You have to somehow relate to the character, right? So it just scores, I don't know, dozens and dozens of these predictors. And it works by you just feeding in your Goodreads or your whatever book ratings. And then the LM goes out, scores your books, your past books on these various features, trains a model on them. And then you can run other books through the pipeline and it will predict how you're going to rate it. So it's fairly standard, I would say. There's a funky involvement of LLMs being the annotators, but that's how it works.
Could you share a few details about the outputs? I don't know if you can benchmark it precisely to like collaborative filtering run or something like that, but what are some of the features or benefits one gets from adopting Isaac method?
Well, we did it for two people so far. So it was a self-study for me, and it was my good friend Erdem who volunteered his a sizable book collection to also try and come up with recommendations for him. The benefits that we got was that the predictions for new unseen books were correlated with our true ratings of these books with like 0.4, etc. We're using all the predictors. So now we can go in to a new book, or we can be a little bit more sure that we're going to like it. We haven't looked at catastrophic mispredictions yet, but that would be really, really interesting as well. So people could just, I don't know, turn this into a website. If somebody wants to do it, they can use my code. I think it's all public. That would be a real cool thing that people could do, and then maybe make a database of already annotated books so that we don't have to rerun this whole thing again and again. Um, I think that would be the main and most obvious benefit for most people. For me, in secret, the coolest thing is the feature importance metrics, saying like, oh, okay, for instance, books about survival, where some usually dystopian setting, something where there's a small cast, like The Road or The Old Man and the Sea, or what is I Who Have Never Known Men, or any of these books where it's a person alone on a plane is somewhere trying to survive. That seems to have a pretty good predictive accuracy for me. And then I got to thinking, like, oh, yeah, that's true. Those things resonate with me. Why do they resonate with me? I've never fought for my life in an abandoned world. Um, and then it gets interesting psychologically. So that's the main benefit for me personally.
Well, you'd mentioned how LLMs are used as annotators in the Isaac work. I believe LLMs have started to play a bigger role in your research in general. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's true, yeah. A lot of my papers recently, I use them as these sort of research assistants where they have to do annotation tasks. And then I typically co-score a random sample of things and see how accurate the LLM worked. And I report that in the paper, like this is how good this LLM research assistant did compared to human annotations, which are then I always have to make the case, well, this human also didn't do perfect, and then I have to get some other human to score it, or even a big random sample of people. And that is awesome for studying books because there's so many variables. There's so much text to read if you are lucky enough to get access to primary sources. Of course, a lot of them you would have to buy the books, but there are some open data sets and fan fiction portals and what have you. Or movie scripts are also often freely available, so you can annotate those. I use them for a lot of those tasks. Now I'm kind of venturing into, okay, let's have the LM also form the hypotheses, and I just check them later for their sensibility. So they are creeping more and more into it, but there's always this, human in the loop, typically me in the loop thing, where I have to quantify how well does this work actually.
Well, they've certainly impacted my day-to-day life. I haven't written a line of code in at least 2 months, maybe more. I just say what code I want written, and it's written for me.
Yeah.
So it's certainly revolutionized my role as a programmer. You also play the role of a fiction writer. Have you had any thoughts on how LLMs are going to impact that profession?
Yeah, I think every fiction writer has a lot of thoughts about this at the moment. We relate to our work very differently than a programmer. I'm also, well, I'm programming a lot. Well, now I'm co-programming a lot, I guess you would say. And I have no hesitations in using LLM for my coding stuff. Of course, always, safeguards, this, that, unit checks, everything. But I would never use an LLM to write creatively for me. It would fully defeat the purpose of doing this thing. As a programmer, I want to work with the product that comes out. I want to generate some data. But as a fiction author, you're expressing who you are, you're expressing what you care about, and you are so opinionated about every single word. I have to think, but I don't think I've ever used it to write even a single sentence. I've written multiple books at this point, so there was plenty of opportunity to just say, oh, well, today I'm really tired, or I don't feel like writing. I'm in that situation, just like every other writer, a lot. So it would be nice to click a button and say, oh, this does the job. But it can't, just like I wouldn't use an LLM to go and do the hanging out with my wife for me. That's not something that I even consider. What I do use it for in terms of creative writing is if I know a word in one language, I don't use it in another, or I know that there's a word out there, but I just can't find it at the moment. I don't Google anymore, like with some awkward search query. I ask an element, I describe the kind of word that I'm looking for, and then it gives a nice, oh yes, exactly, that's what I meant. So that's how I use it in my creative writing. And I sometimes talk to it on long drives or under the shower, etc., verbally, like, okay, I have to write about this character that is really into constructing buildings, factory buildings. How do you get to that? What's the career like? And then it talks to me a little bit, etc. And then, oh, how are you good at this job? And what are the most famous people? And it talks back to me. So I just use it as a learning tool, and that learned stuff that later might end up in the book. But that's kind of like a casual way that goes in, just like a researchy way to use them.
Well, I don't know your exact creative process, but I know for some authors, there's a phase at which you give your script to a reviewer, like a trusted friend that will give honest and valuable feedback. Do you think LLMs are at the level of maturity where they could play that role?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of positive experiences with it, so I pay quite a lot of money to editors, human editors, that review my fiction work. So no, I've tried to use it for like finding errors, etc. But the reality is that things like Grammarly, which I guess also use various models or whatever in the background, I don't know, they are really good and they're better than me copy pasting the text here, there, etc. I made my own Google Docs plugin a while ago, so I can use AI when I write, my scientific work. When my scientific work, I also don't use AI to write it, but I try to do the reviewing thing. Like, is this logically coherent? Where can I be more concise, etc. It's not that great at that either. It is okay. I don't know. Maybe for some people it's great. For me, I wasn't happy with it. It is good, I think, at summarizing things that I don't want to read. That it does well with scientific papers, etc. So I use it for that, but otherwise, no.
One of the things I wanted to ask, just kind of in conclusion, was given your familiarity now with Goodreads, both as a user and its data set, if they reached out to you and said, hey, what do you think we should do? Any changes we should make? What advice might you have?
So essentially, they could build my recommendation system that I built for myself into the platform, right? Meaning they could give you a characterization of your reading preferences, correlations of your star ratings with attributes of the books, etc. They could break down the comment section using AI so that certain things, certain markers are automatically flagged. For instance, for some people, it's really important that there's no swearing in the book, for example. They don't really don't like that. And it's always in the comment sections like, oh, why was it in there, etc. Very easy with any NLP method to get those information out and have it there. That's kind of the minimal thing. It's kind of the thing that you can say to every company: do more stuff with the cool data that you have. Try to make a user product or feature out of it. I think they can probably get some inspiration from the papers. But overall, I like the website. I'm using it all the time. So.
And what's next for you?
Next for me is I'm currently looking more at primary sources. So I really want to analyze not metadata and not reader comments, but I want to analyze book contents. Unfortunately, that means that now I'm going to have to walk away from current bestsellers, etc., and I have to go towards open source texts, classics, whatever, or public domain things, fan fiction, or movie scripts. That's the direction that I go into, so that I can be closer to the author. I want to be closer to the words that the authors write and analyze those, because then I don't have to take the indirect route over readers and the comment sections or the Wikipedia articles about books. So most of my upcoming work, I think, will be going in that area.
And I usually like to wind up with a question about where people can follow you, but I'm going to ask you the question twice. First, as a fiction author, can you tell listeners a little bit about what you write and where they can find it?
I write books that are characterized by my life and who I am as a psychologist and an academic. So if you're interested in academic fiction, magical realism, funny campus stories where there's students wandering at night over the campus and do weird magical things, then you can find me and should find me on my website, hannesrosenbusch.com. And for research, you can reach out to me via the usual ways. I think there's probably some contact information on the university website, University of Amsterdam, Hannes Rosenbusch. You can reach me there.
We'll have notes in the show notes for listeners to follow up. Hannes, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Thanks so much for having me, Kyle.